Welcome to Series 4 of the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And we pay our respects to leaders past, present and emerging. In this series, we're talking with amazing mums. We ask their tips, advice on how they raise their boys, all the while leading successful and diverse lives. As usual, we ask our questions of what is it to be a good man these days? And if you had a story that you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd listen, what would the story be? I'm Dr. Ray Swan, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys in the modern world. The series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school based in Melbourne, Australia. In today's conversation, we speak with Jacquie Hey. Jacquie has a diverse background, working mostly as a company director. She started life working in IT and telecommunications, spent a number of years in Australia and then internationally, and then took on roles in finance, marketing, sales and leadership. And she brings all of this experience and wisdom to her roles, mostly as a director, being chair of Bendigo and Adelaide Bank Limited, chair of the Remuneration Committee at Qantas. She's also previously worked for Cricket Australia and is on the Brighton Grammar School Council. In the conversation today, we talk a bit about mothering, about balancing out the work and life challenges, but also she gives some really interesting advice about the world and the future of the world, and maybe one or two of the things that we can really focus on as we hope to prepare our boys to be successful. Well, welcome, Jacquie Hey. Thank you so much for your time in advance to the Understanding Boys podcast. It's great to have this opportunity to chat with you, and knowing you a little as I do, someone who's had a tremendous career, but also a mum and raising a boy and what that looks like. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to chat to you. Firstly, a bit about your work and your sense about culture and building culture and gender in the workplace and what we might learn about as parents in that. Some of your reflections on being a mum, as well as, a little bit about your thoughts about where to for the world and the world that our boys are entering, and what are some of the things that we might need to focus a little bit on. And I imagine you're privy to some conversations, certainly at a director level, about the sort of the future of things and where things might be headed. And I think sometimes in the day-to-day, we don't always think about that. We get a little bit caught up in the, the lunches and the, what did you do todays? And sometimes it's good for us to have a bit of a view on that as well. So maybe, a good place to start is, what makes up a lot of your work, just so our listeners have a sense of the kind of work that you do and, what maybe even a little bit about what led you to the work that you do.
Yeah, thanks, Ray. I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. So the kind of work I do, which is sometimes hard to explain, but I'm a board director. So I sit on listed company boards, being Qantas and Bendigo and Adelaide Bank, and also on a government board. I'm on the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation board, which looks after the superannuation of all our Defence Force and public servants. And I'm also on the Brighton Grammar Council, which is, of course, my most favourite board. But in all of those, the things that are common is we're there as board members or as directors to really help test the strategy, the approach, the thinking of the executive team there, and also to make sure that the governance works. And by that, it's making sure that the finances are in order, that we're doing all the things we need to do from a regulatory perspective, etc. But the fun parts are absolutely the couple of things that you talked about in your introduction. It's looking further forward, and it's really trying to imagine where the future is going to take us, and then make sure whatever company it is at the time, we're doing the right things to get us there. But I fundamentally, I sit as a group of people who test the CEO and the management team of companies on what they're doing, how they're doing it, and whether they're doing it right, and all the stakeholders will therefore be happy with it, or as happy as they can be.
Yeah, very important role in that mixture of oversight and strategy, finding a way of, working with people, building their trust and confidence, I guess, in that they're comfortable with someone such as yourself, kind of, picking a little bit at, the practice and asking those kinds of questions. I imagine there's been some times where that's gone really, really well, and maybe some times where perhaps it hasn't. I'm just interested, Jacquie, for those of us who aren't directors, what getting to your own work that led you to that. What was it in your own sort of vocational drive that took you there, or was it just that kind of life unfolded in such a way as that you've ended up doing that sort of work?
Look, when I speak to people, I speak to lots of people in career advice and in mentoring. That's one of the other things I do a lot of. And I tell them how important it is to plan things and to start undertaking activities in your working life so that beyond your original working life, it all works out well. I didn't plan it at all, Ray. I had a working life where I worked in technology, and I was lucky enough to work in many countries overseas, and I ended up being CEO and managing director of a few companies in different parts of the world. And then I wanted to come home, and I came home, and in coming home, it was like, okay, so now I need to find a job, and what's next? And I actually took it was almost a year off, and I was a real mum for the first time ever.
Wow.
in some ways. That's controversial, isn't it? And I'd always felt like I was a real mum when I was working long hours doing big jobs, but then all of a sudden I realised it wasn't just quality. There was a bit about quantity that I'd missed out on.
Uh-huh.
So I took about a year off, but then I started to think about, all right, I would like to have a bit more of a balance of working life and non-working life. And I saw an advert for SBS, the multicultural radio and TV broadcaster, and they were looking for a board director. And I thought, I know nothing about TV and radio, but I know a lot about technology, and I know about running businesses. And my father was had come out to Australia when he was 7 from the Netherlands with his family after the war. So I had a bit of a multicultural aspect to me. So I just almost on whim or on a non-thought out decision thought, that would be really interesting. I'm going to fill in that form and see how I go. And I got that role, and that kind of got me onto this is a career path I hadn't thought of, but it sounds like it's going to be a lot of fun, and I can work in industries and areas where I haven't been for the last 20 odd years or so. So I got into that, and then I went into banking with Bendigo at Adelaide Bank, and then I was in some investment companies, and I've done all sorts of things across all industries, energy, and I'm now in aviation, banking and superannuation. So it's led me to some really interesting experiences. One of the most interesting ones I had, and I'm sure you'll get to at some point, is I joined the board of Cricket Australia, and they had been in existence for 107 years when I joined, and I was the first female ever to join. So that was kind of a big one for gender balance the other way round.
Yeah, absolutely. As I'm listening to you speak, and you're going through the variety of different places that you've worked, one of the things I know as a teacher that we often focus on, and it's age and stage, I guess, and contextually dependent, is that we want our kids to have really strong kind of, I guess, subject knowledge and, technical knowledge. And but listening to you speak, it seems like in your career, actually there must be a separate set of skills or is it knowledge or is it practices that you are actually able to apply in lots of different contexts? I mean, is there a central set of skills that you feel are kind of universally applicable that even might be relevant to kids and adolescents as they're growing up in terms of management and your ability to work across such diverse workplaces?
I think there are a number of things that are really useful across different workplaces. And of course, some of them are technical. So I had a technology. I graduated in economics and then completely didn't work in that area at all, went into the technology industry and I understood technology at the strategy level. So I had sort of a branch to my skills around technology that was interesting. Although if you ask my son, he'll tell you I can't even do the remote control properly. But around technology strategy and I had some understanding there. But the things that probably helped me the most now working across industries is some of those skills that people refer to as softer skills, but they're really not. It's the ability to listen and understand where other people are coming from, to be empathetic and to put yourself in their shoes so that when you're thinking about the future or when you're thinking about wanting an organisation to go in a certain way, it's always about the people. So it's about how do you put yourself in their shoes? How do you understand what motivates people? How do you listen to what they're saying so that you can think about why they're coming from a direction they're coming from? And it's about, from a board perspective, there's usually somewhere between 7 and 9 of us sitting around a table, and we have to come to some very important decisions as a group. And so understanding that I don't have all the answers, but I know that others do, and really listening to them and extracting from them the bits that I don't know, and then questioning, why are they saying that? Where is it coming from? And how does that help me build on my thinking? Those kind of skills are really important, irrespective of what you decide to do, where you do it, or whom you do it with.
I guess those skills are, again, in the traditional sense, they're not often equated with the masculine, the sort of the dominant masculine thing. You're talking about soft skills of listening, empathy, and people skills, and yet, a lot of the dominant messaging of past and is around, being a doer, being, very good at something, really having all the answers, leading by example, leading from the front. These are sort of a lot of the dominant messages I think our kids and our boys get around that. But actually, it is interesting, isn't it, just listening to you speak, just how clearly, it's so important that we are providing the context and the learning for our kids that are actually unpacking what some of those things look like. Because to be successful in life, it's the soft skills that they're going to need.
Yeah, definitely. And if I go back to when I started work, which is decades ago now, you needed to be strong and tough and able to articulate your vision and bring people with you. You didn't need to listen because it wasn't something that was considered important in those times. Fast forward to now, if you're not, as a CEO, as a leader, as an aspiring young professional, if you're not listening to people around you and what the community's saying and what the latest issue is on social media, if you're not listening to stakeholders and listening to the world and listening to really understand how this all works, you're not going to get anywhere. And there's not many CEOs appointed today that aren't very good at listening, understanding, empathizing, and then coming out with what they think is the best way forward. But those CEOs of the past that always had the answers, that they don't exist very often anymore.
And I guess the other skill that you're referring to there is that ability to, and I always say this word really terribly, and I'm on a podcast, it's going to sound awful, to synthesize, got it out, all of that information as well, because you're listening, and I just can imagine you're in a room with 7 people with a variety and a diversity, and again, straight away you can see why diversity is important, diversity of view, diversity of perspective, understanding the various kind of, pressure points in the decision making, but also then somehow having that process of being able to stitch things together into a coherent narrative to be able to, again, go back to the CEO or to go back to, the group to test and say, well, look, this is the view, that you're actually able to draw that together. That must be another skill set that you need to develop. I imagine there's a reasonable amount of wisdom that's involved in acquiring that skill as well. I don't think it's something you're going to do when you're 15.
Yeah, there is. And the world is so complex now that no one person can have all the answers at all. And so in the past, when listening was just waiting for your turn to speak, today it's going, I really can't possibly know everything that's going on. So how do I get myself informed as best as I can? And early on in my career, I worked for a Swedish company, and so I went over to Sweden and was based there for some time. And they had a cultural way of working that at the time I found really odd. You couldn't make a decision. It didn't matter what level of the organisation you were in. You couldn't make a decision until you had socialised that decision with all the stakeholders that are important around the group. So what you had to do is go, I was a young product manager. I had a product that I had to launch onto a global stage. And so I knew what I wanted to do, but I couldn't do it without having the people that were going to support it involved, the people that were going to market it involved, the people that were going to provide the financing involved, etc. So I had to painfully go talk to all these groups, explain what I wanted to do, listen to what they wanted, incorporate that in, play it back to them, get their sign off and go forward. And I remember at the time as a young executive, very young, what a waste of time this was. It's taken me 4 weeks to get to do something that I knew in 4 hours was right. But then when I launched it, it all went perfectly because
Right.
everyone was on board and they all supported me, and off we went. And so I kind of sat back as a young person in business and went, oh, that was actually quite useful, because if I'd just gone out and done it, they would have found lots of reasons why it couldn't have been wrong. We would have been months down the track, or it would have failed. So very early on, I learnt in the Swedish way it was socialisation, but in the way that I think about it, it's just listening and building on what you already know and making sure you're bringing people with you. How important that was.
Yeah, it's a great term, the socialisation of an idea. I know in education we have two things where one of them is that, we have what the idea is, and the other, and do we agree on the common, issue or problem or the thing that we're trying to solve, and then we also look at and what is everyone's agreement on how we might solve that, and sort of test into that, and that sort of theory of action or change. And it is fascinating because I'm thinking as you're speaking as well about technology and how many of those cues, like I imagine again, going back to your story and going around and canvassing, and not only are you finding out and socialising, but you actually are being social, which is why I love the term, because I guess if someone came to me and, Jacquie came to me and said, well, this is my idea, this is what I'm thinking, I'm feeling like I'm valued, I'm feeling like I've got to say, I'm feeling respected, and so again, when you, I guess in terms of the I don't know if it's a democratization of the idea or the as it's pointed out to everybody, they're all involved and they're all sort of getting a nod. And with technology these days, I find that, I don't know about you, but since COVID, it's much harder to sort of test in that way because I find in groups with actual people, there's so much more that you can kind of pick up on, and little looks and pauses. And, again, when we're online, if we stop speaking, it's a bit of a glitch and you're worried, whereas in real life, if someone stops speaking, it's just, okay, they're pausing and thinking. Have you noticed much of a change in your ability to be able to socialise ideas in the modern world with technology?
Totally. So I chair the Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. So I've been running the meetings, or I run the board meetings. And in the last couple of years, when we've been online, I can see people's faces and I can call them up based on who I can see on my screen, but I can't pick up those nuances of, I can see Ray's rolling his eyes here, or just glancing differently, or he's got that little twitch that I know that happens because I know him. That means he's upset or he's excited or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Those social clues that you don't realise how much you pick them up and use them to help a conversation or to help broaden thinking, or to help an idea get even better. Totally missed all of those, and you do totally miss them on the screen. And I even got to the point where I forgot that I was missing them because we got so used to just doing screen stuff. And now that we're back meeting in person, the common view at the moment is, oh my gosh, how much more powerful was that meeting? How much more useful was it? Because we're all sitting together and we can build on each other, and it just works better. So technology's got its place, and I'm the last person who'd say it hasn't. It's got its place, but not 100% of the time. Yeah. Meeting people face to face, knowing them, recognising that those non-verbal cues that you just can't get as well over the screen, and building on each other's ideas, so important.
I wonder where it leaves us as parents, obviously the focus of this podcast being on raising boys, boys like ours who spent a lot of time, at crucial developmental stages, spending an awful lot of time online, learning online, socialising online, the impact of that, and, the where to. I don't know about you, Jacquie, but as a dad sometimes with my kids, I do wrestle with this challenge of technology, and particularly technology in its and how it impacts, I guess, developmentally, and, using your example of socialisation.
Yeah, look, I think technology does some amazing things, and the world is a better place for it. But it's when it does everything that's the problem. And in the last couple of years, it's at least felt like for our kids, it's been the main way in which they've interacted with their teachers or their uni lecturers or their friends, or their relatives, or all the other people that we haven't been able to see in person. And I think now that we can be freer and we can get out and about, it's probably changed us forever in some way. And so leaving that crutch behind that technology became, and getting back out there in the world is is really very important. And I think we see that in a work environment, we see it in a social environment, a school environment. So it will yet to be seen, I suspect, in the decade to come, how it's affected all of us. And I'm sure it's affected all of us in ways that we don't yet know.
I think you're right. I was listening to a talk the other day, and the speakers were talking about that lack of connection to nature and how nature is able to provide us with the stop cues, the limits. You know, if we're in nature, if we're cold, you will be cold. If you don't eat, you won't, you know. Whereas these days, you know, through technology, where we have this limitlessness, and again, developmentally, I do worry about that, you know, and I guess there is a movement, the rewilding movement. I don't know if I've quite got that right, but that idea of just how important it is for us to spend time, to make it a real feature and function of our raising of our kids at the moment, that we actually really do get the devices away, get outside. Even now, you know, in Australia, it's obviously going into winter, you know, making sure that we're planning a time to walk the dog, or, you know, lighting a fire if we have one in the backyard, or, you know, in a fireplace, or just reading a book, like doing those things that really do ground us, and really sort of strengthen our connection and to the everydayness, you know, moving away from, as you say, that the way in which technology took up so many of our interactions, whether it was in work, learning, socialising, you know, nothing against Netflix per se, but, you know, that as a brand identity, you know, that thing we're just watching constant series, and it's never ending.
Yeah, no, look, it's very true. And, you know, as a sort of an analogy, because it's felt like we've been in a bit of a bubble with, you know, with our screens in the last couple of years. And as an analogy, if I go to cricket, where we had dealt with elite athletes who live an unusual life. They in some ways live in a bubble because they travel, they play at elite levels, they train constantly, etc. They don't get a chance to necessarily walk the dog or go out to nature or do other things. And when cricket got into a bit of trouble with some of its issues, one of the key things they did about moving forward was many things, but one that relates to what you just said was just getting back to reality. So they, if you noticed after the sandpaper activity, when they started playing matches, at the end of every day, they'd go around and they'd talk to the crowd and they'd sign autographs and they'd high five and they'd take selfies, and they would be talking to the crowd. And that wasn't a, you know, let's look good on cameras. That was a, go talk to them because you're their cricket team. Go ask them what they think. Go get their views. Go interact with people and see what you think. And they did other things like go to Gallipoli when they were travelling overseas to really, and each of them had to bring a story about a relative or someone that they knew or had investigated who'd been there, or who knew someone who'd been there, or who had a story about it. And so they all came with a personal story, and it's connection, and it's getting back to reality, and it's having your feet firmly planted on the ground, and all those things are just so important in being good human beings, and that's what we all want to do, and the rest of it flows from there.
It's interesting. It must be very hard for a person in their 20s or, you know, late 20s to understand the significance of what they represent culturally or as a phenomenon as the national cricket team, you know, particularly here in Australia. And I think we've just seen, you know, the very sad news recently of cricketers who have, you know, have passed away in untimely all instances, and you know, just the impact of that, I think, culturally and in the, I guess, the national dialogue. And then at the time when you're playing and thinking about it, and you're in this bubble and it's high pressure, you know, it really is high stakes. And again, for those young men and women who do represent our national teams, it's there's a lot there, isn't there? And boy, how do you educate? How do you provide, you know, the cultural markers, and I guess, as you were pointing to, the rituals and processes that support some simple changes? It must have been a lot to think about, you know, in the work that you were doing during that time.
Yeah, look, there absolutely was. And, you know, one of the biggest things that I found around the now infamous Sandpapergate was, and there was so much wrong with that, right? And that no one knew that more than the three people involved in it. And that was absolutely clear from my understanding. And they were three young men who were good men, and they they suffered so much. So everyone had an opinion on it, but no one should have had an opinion more so than those three. And the public, I think, got a small glimpse of that during their press conferences of how impactful that was to relatively young men to carry the world on their shoulders and for it to fall so far. And a lot of people in this world make mistakes, Ray. I've made them. You've made them, I bet. And we get away with them. Sometimes you pay a price for them. Sometimes you get away with them. Sometimes people make big mistakes and they get away with them. Sometimes they make small mistakes and they move on. But I think what I learnt the most from that incident was the resilience that you need to come back from a terrible situation and keep going. And it was very inspiring. So irrespective of your opinion of the three people involved, I was incredibly inspired about how they were at the lowest of lows in their lives and how each of them pulled themselves back out of that. And I think for me, it reminded me at all times that good people can make mistakes. In a moment of pressure, you can do things you wouldn't otherwise do. And sometimes people pay enormous price for those mistakes. But what we all need to do, and what I learned, was it's how you respond to that. It's how you recover from that. And it's the resilience you need to get back going from that can be really quite inspiring.
It's amazing, isn't it? I'm reminded of the New Testament story of, not throwing the first, who hasn't done something wrong, you can throw the first stone. I mean, it is, and whether, again, it's a function of our modern culture, the transparency, which is great in some ways because we get to see lots of things and, we're connecting faster, but at the same time, it does seem to have engendered perhaps a spirit of real, genuine criticism that, and almost seeking out. I'm not in any way, dismissing people's, criticisms of whether it's what happened there or anywhere else, but there does seem to be a bit of a critical culture where it makes it difficult for people to learn. And just circling back to, parenting and raising boys, I know for myself as a school teacher and, talking with kids when they make mistakes, they might make a mistake about, a post that they put online somewhere, or they made a mistake about something that they said or regrettable action. One of the most important things that we can do with young people and young men is actually just give them a safe space that they can actually unpack what happened, really develop a clear understanding of what those steps are and what they need to do to firstly face the consequence, which happens, but also to remediate, to seek to make right, what occurred. And unless people are actually able to really sit with what they've done, they can never do that. And I just think sometimes we're so quick to judge without all the information that it makes it really difficult. It actually hinders our ability to grow and change as individuals, but ultimately as a culture as well.
Yeah, look, I think you've said it very nicely. We are, as a society, far more critical than we've ever been, or at least we're far more able to criticise in a non filtered way, and that's good and that's bad at the same time. I think it's I do feel like it's harder for the youth of today because they are being openly judged and externally judged from the minute they get on social media, and it goes all the way through. Some part of that, and some people, that will make them tougher and more resilient and more able to deal with and understand who matters to me, whose judgment matters to me and whose judgment doesn't matter to me. And I think that's the good side of it. And the bad side of it is if you haven't been in somebody's shoes, you don't actually know what they're going through, why they did what they did, or how they're recovering from it, or how generally remorseful they are. And I think allowing people to make mistakes and giving them the space, as you said, to be remorseful about that and to move on is something in humanity that we've got to keep.
Yeah,
because otherwise it's going to be tough, because I haven't met a perfect person yet.
No,
including myself.
Person in the mirror. No, and it circles back, I think, Jacquie, to what you were saying earlier about those soft skills, that you were talking about how important it is that we listen, that we have, that we actually have, we seek first to, these are my words now, but, we seek first to understand rather than be understood, as people, and helping to engender those qualities, in all our kids, but also in our boys. I wanted to circle around on mothering, and you were chatting about your transition back here, and there's a couple of transitions I'd love to chat to you about. One is obviously when our children leave school, because that's a recent change for you and your parenting. But I wanted to chat about mothering, and you were talking about you used the being a real mum was a phrase that you used, and
I apologise to all mums for that, working mums for that, which I was for most of my life. So yes, I did use that phrase.
Yeah, and people can't see, but I've done the apostrophes, doing a gesture as I say that, which probably if people could see that they would understand the term and how that was used. But I just wondered, does it feel, and certainly, mums that I've spoken to, sometimes it can really feel like you're not having success anywhere, like you're not having enough time in your mothering, you're not having enough time in your work and in your career, in your with your partner, and then all the other various roles that you have. And it can feel, as I'm told, that you're always kind of on this, not a virtuous cycle, you're at the other end, you're sort of, depleting and always failing in a sense. How have you been able to address that in your life and seek that life balance that we all crave?
I got some advice early on that when I was sort of starting that, women now can have it all and do it all and be it all. And that was just rubbish, because it hasn't worked for me anyway, and I don't know who it does work for. So the thing that I've always done is be very true and clear to myself that I have made choices in life, and I will live with those choices, and there's trade-offs associated with them, and I'm not going to regret those trade-offs because they're based on the choices that I made.
Yeah.
And so that's not to say that there's not times in my life where I think, oh my gosh, what on earth am I doing here, as I've got off my plane for the 10th time this month, and I'm seeing my son in short bursts, and my husband's a distant memory because I haven't spent a night with him for a while. So I certainly had those periods, but every time it got too much, I just take a step back and go, it's your life choices, you make them, and then you've got to live with them, and beating yourself up about them is not going to make anything better. So deep breath, make my choices, living with the trade-offs. When I don't like those trade-offs anymore, I should make another choice.
Yeah, very pragmatic advice. It's great. And I'm interested in, is that when you hear that voice in you, is that, in your own family, closer family circle, and how you grew up in the family situation, was that a voice that you had? Did you have great role models that also kind of impacted your way in which you were able to make decisions?
I had a fairly traditional working father, stay-at-home mum, but what I did have was very pragmatic and practical parents.
Yeah.
And that's the bit that I've taken on from them.
Yeah, great. And did they give you any great, obviously they've given you probably from what it sounds like, I could be wrong here, but it sounds like they gave you great working examples. But did they give you any great advice? And did they also, conversely, did they give any bad advice that in the modern world, you kind of go, nah, look, that might have been good in the day, but, now it's different?
I can't quite think of any really bad advice they gave me, although they did try. I grew up down past Geelong, and at the time I went to uni. They wanted me to go to Deakin Uni so I could stay in Geelong, and at the time Deakin Uni wasn't great. Today I'd happily go to Deakin Uni, send my child to Deakin. I think it's one of the better ones in terms of educating people to get a job and to be in the real world. So this is nothing about Deakin. But at the time I went, I just do not want to stay in Geelong. I do not want to go to Deakin Uni. I've got to broaden my horizons. And I went
I've
to
got companies to run and
yeah, exactly.
And direct.
Exactly.
So
no, I wasn't thinking of any of that. I was just thinking of get out of the small town I grew up in and go somewhere else. So I don't know where I would have got to in life if I'd stayed in Geelong and not moved out. So that was probably one thing where they didn't where they wanted me to stay closer to home. But ignoring that, they've pretty much given me good advice all my life and supported me in whatever I wanted to do. And that's all you need from a parent, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so true. And
go spread your wings, do what you want, and we'll support you with whatever.
Yeah, and you know what? In all the conversations I've had with people, and we've ever chatted about parents and parenting, that just that those basics just keep coming through. You know, the belief in the child, the love, the care, the good food, the home. Just about how important that can really be, as you know, someone who gives you that voice. I often think of it that when we are stretched, particularly in those early years of our careers, you know, we often will hear our parents' voice. You know, that urging onward. I was reading a book recently about the origin of our internal voice. You know, that voice that never seems to, the monkey mind, the little chatterer that keeps going.
Keeps going. Yep.
Yeah, and you know, there are developmental psychologists that argue that is very much you know, that's formed, you know, a lot from parents as well, you know, and they do it the whole time and then you start doing it and then that never ceases. So, yeah, it can be very impactful.
Yeah, look, I think so too. And as we get older, we all realise we're turning some way into our parents and our children, as much as they won't want to hear that, you know, will happen to them too. So we have to set the right internal voice in them so that when it's talking to them later in life, it's all good stuff.
Yeah, it's our ultimate revenge.
Yeah, or the other.
Or the other way around.
If we want to be mean.
Yeah. I heard Nick Cave talk about that, actually, the Australian, you know, singer-songwriter, and he's, you know, in his inimitable fashion, he said, you know, I increasingly became aware I was turning into my own father, you know, and that sort of declamatory tone that he has. But, yeah, it does seem to be true, and I'm recognising sheepishly at times, recognising my dad in me as well, which is a bit scary to see, and it's certainly scary for my kids. Just lastly on mothering and parenting, you know, the transitions and, you know, kids going from, you know, into prep and that first, you know, goodbye and the transition into secondary and obviously with some of our listeners thinking about the kids as they leave school. You know, it's pretty early in the leaving school bit, but just from your perspective, Jacquie, what have you sort of seen with your boy and how he's sort of managing that, and what's it required from you, you know, as a mum? Like, what changes have you had to make subsequent to that and coming out of the everyday school environment?
Yeah, I think you know, there's a couple of things. I think our boys and our children are much more resilient than we can imagine all the way through. So whilst change can be hard, they tend to manage it every time with a hiccup or two maybe, but they get through it. And in some ways, I think for me, it's been harder as a mum to manage those changes when he first went to school and when he went to the big school and now that he's finished year 12 and going on to university. You know, I have to kind of take a deep breath and know that he's an adult now and let him go with it. And certainly I don't always get it right, and he will still occasionally say, you know, I'm 18, right, Mum? and he's right. And so I always say, yes, but when you're 35, I'm still going to tell you to do X, Y, and Z, whatever it was. So there is that adjustment, and parents and kids they have a different relationship, and in some ways you get closer and you can be more of a friend, but there's still those boundaries that where you are the parent. So there's a lot of adjustment for me as well as for him, but it's a nice time to see your child into adulthood. It's terrific, and I do feel a little concerned that the world that they're entering is probably not as welcoming as the world that I entered when I went into adulthood. So I think there's a lot, you know, going back to we need to be kind to each other, and we need to understand where people are coming from and be less critical and less judgmental, that we just have to remember every day, because it's a tough world out there.
Yeah, absolutely. What are some of your thoughts on the future and how we prepare them? I mean, it seems, you know, our parents will be listening to, you know, changes to the disruption at higher education. We're seeing, you know, changes to what people are valuing and privileging in the workplace by way of, you know, I guess the educational process being one, but also the skills process. And, you know, do we need kids doing, what about languages? You know, a couple of years ago I was hearing people say we need to teach them all how to code. That was big for a couple of years. But more seriously, I mean, how do what are some of the things that you're talking about in your groups that we can start to be mindful of as we prepare our kids for the future?
Look, I think there are many things. So certainly the flexibility and the work-life balance is genuinely easier these days than it was when I left school and university. So I think that's a good thing. And I think it's important for our boys to think about, what balance do they want, and make those same trade-off choices that I made, but there's probably more available to them now. I think and I don't know if they want to hear this, those who are at school or at university, but lifelong learning is what it's all about these days. So you don't finish school or finish uni and go to work and phew, that's it, I've finished with my learning. It's the world changes so fast, and the jobs that kids of today are doing will be so different in the future than they are now, rapidly. So continuing to learn, continuing to be curious, to continuing to open your mind for what more do I need to know, and how do I need to know it is really important. I think young men going into business today, that they can actually, there's a lot of activities going on in gender balance, and there's a lot of support for women, rightly so, because it's been tough for girls and women getting into many aspects of business in the past. So it's right that it's there. But for young men that are coming out of school today and university, and particularly those I think coming through BGS, that they know a lot of this, right? They've had some really good schooling, really good role models in terms of equality of women, and they're enlightened, and they'll be working with some dinosaurs who are perhaps not enlightened and need to go through a whole lot of retraining on that. And I think for our boys, it's really important that they understand that there are still huge opportunities there for young men. They will shine. They've come through an education with BGS where they've got the breadth of the education about being an impressive young man, about as well as learning maths and science and English and all the other things they need to learn. And in going into companies, they'll still be the majority. So that's the good news. And they'll come out of school with, I think, a much better perspective than many people in the past. And that's only going to stand them in good stead in the future.
What is it to be a good man these days?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, but I would say, as I started with, to be a good person, I think you need to be open to ideas and to be able to listen really well and be curious and learn and be kind to yourself. All of that's really important. Being resilient is such a overused word, but so important, because the world does throw stuff at us, whether it's COVID or whether it's a small issue in a workplace or whether it's something that's happened in your neighbourhood. You know that you can bounce back, and you will bounce back, and life can be hard sometimes, but you'll get there. I think you should also, we talked about this too, Ray, everyone's going to make mistakes. So knowing that you can recover from them is really key, because mistakes are just more easy to see these days than they were in the past. And so being a good man knows you'll make mistakes, but it's how you recover from them that will show really what a good man you are.
And if you had a story you could tell a boy of 14 and he'd listen, what would the story be?
Yeah, that's I was never a boy at 14, but if I could say something that maybe appeals to boys at 14, I think you will have no idea how life will turn out. So I was a completely uncoordinated and untalented sports person as a kid. I won nothing. The only thing I ever got a medal for sporting-wise was an egg and spoon race in about grade 3. And I ended up running an organisation of elite athletes who represented Australia for 8 years. So I think the message I'd give to any 14-year-old boy is you don't know what life will turn out like, and just trust that, even if you've had difficult times along the way, it can turn out very interesting and very wonderful.
Jacquie, it's been
very unexpected.
Yeah. Jacquie, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time. You've just given us so much wisdom. A sense I think that's really come through is one of the real parts of this conversation for me and big takeaway was about the value of listening. I think also the value of compassion and building empathy, and something that we're really strong in engendering in our kids and in our boys in particular. And finally, I'm never going to try and race you in an egg and spoon race, because I think you're going to beat me. But more seriously, thanks for everyone here at Understanding Boys.
No, thank you, Ray. I've enjoyed chatting to you.
We hope you've enjoyed this Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.